Welcome to the Rimo3 podcast. In each episode, the team at Rimo3 is joined by tech leaders and innovators in the end-user computing and cloud desktop space to explore current and upcoming innovations and technology.
So thank you everybody for joining today. I'm your host, Samit Halvadia, CTO at Rimo3. And today what we're really going to focus on with our very special guest is really the importance of compliance and security as people start looking to move away from just on-prem and the data center towards cloud platforms like AVD, Windows 365, and a couple of the others that are out there. And more importantly, how do you kind of balance some of the stuff that's happening on-prem and hybrid to get to the point where you can have a confident security posture as you move forward with your EUC environments, right? So today I'm joined by Patrick Coble, who doesn't really need an introduction. If you're listening to this nerdy podcast, chances are you already know who Patrick is. But for those of you that don't, he is a VMware vExpert, part of the EUC program there. And I've known Patrick for several years as being one of the upstanding individuals that is always looked at as a kind of authoritative figure around VDI, user segmentation, app segmentation, deployments in general. But recently, Patrick's taken a little bit of a shift where he's now focusing a little bit more on VDI security. He's the founder of VDISecurity.org and has been kind enough to join us for today's session. So, Patrick, welcome and thank you.
No problem. Thank you guys for having me. This should be fun.
I'm looking forward to it. And actually, one of the questions I've wanted to ask for some time is, I see people evolving over the last 20 years. We're an incestuous community, right? The VDI virtualization experts. And one of the things that we've seen is people kind of go on, they're the app guy, or they're the user guy, or they're the roaming profile guy. You've done all of those, but over the last couple of years, you've changed a little bit and evolved further than me anyway, and kind of focused on security. What's brought that around?
Yeah, so I mean, even from my, computer hacking days back in the 80s when floppies were still floppy and computers had cup holders, that's kind of where, the movies War Games and Hackers, I got into computer security. And I was in it even through some of my first jobs and through the Marine Corps, but really it's always been a passion of mine and it's been fun. But then I got into consulting just from, working at a Citrix shop and AD. And so I basically went from a security engineer to their infrastructure nerd and then to the Citrix nerd because I was the only one that knew about it. And it was just because I had been playing with it since I guess, saw it in the early 90s, but really playing with it in the late 90s. And I did that and did consulting all the way till 2016. 2016, I could start to see that there was a huge gap in security and VDI
Sure.
because I was just doing health assessments like everybody else, every other partner in the world, like, you got to check this box and it'll make 1,000 users happy. And so I was doing that, but I was like, no one's paying attention to the security and everyone's using VDI. And so I was like, I've got to do that. So 2016 is when I broke out on my own and
Okay.
said, hey, I'm going to make a company that's focused on just VDI security and just go after that. And really that's also the inception point of I said to myself, and I had seen a bunch of people like Brian Madden and Jarian Gibson and Dane Young and Ron Oglesby and like all these like EUC superstar Sean Bass, and I saw them and I was like, oh, man, that is cool what they do, because I remembered as a consultant how much knowledge I gained through their blogs, through their
Sure.
tweets, and was like, oh yeah, that's a better way to look at it. Yeah, they are right. But then I was like, but no one's talking about security. And here I was like a security nerd in a Citrix admin body, and I was like, hey, I gotta do something different. So I did, and that's also what started me wanting to be a CTP, a vExpert, and hopefully one day a Microsoft MVP. Was I wanted to be able to give focused feedback and just be that security nerd on those things because I understand all the VDI things.
Yeah.
And so my big moment would have been Orlando E2E VC in 2017. That would have been the first presentation that I did, not as a partner, but as Patrick Coble, and as a VDI security nerd, Patrick Coble. And that's what, and then, Stephanie Roper, I don't know, that's
Yeah.
her awards right behind me, the community award from my Citrix user group. And she was the one that said, you should apply. And I was like, I don't think I should. And she's like, you should. It was really, really good. I even understood it. Right. And I was like, okay. And so she kept mentoring me, and Jarian and Dane and Sean and a couple others were like, yeah, do it. And so I started applying and started blogging, started speaking more. And really, I guess I just do a lot more speeches than everyone else. I do more speeches than I do blogs. And it's just
Yeah.
kind of, I guess I'm a talker, right? But that's kind of been my thing. So like I've been keeping track of it. And so I've done 124 speeches with 6,775 participants over the past couple
Wow.
years. So that's like my thing. And so I love getting to talk about security. And sometimes I do security that's related to VDI, but I just did like the Philly Citrix user group a couple weeks ago, and we just talked about privacy and credit
Oh,
card fraud and how to
right on.
protect your identity. So it had nothing to do with Citrix or VDI or anything, had everything to do with just cybersecurity in general and your identity and your family's identity. And so it was so fun to be able to speak about those things that some of those people had never heard of any of these things and these topics and trends. So that's kind of really what's kept me going. And, when I first started, I was doing like 90% VDI, 10% as security work. And now it's the other way. So it's 90+% of security work and 10 and less percent of real normal VDI clickety click. So it's been fun. It's been a cool ride for sure.
So, it's got, it's always an interesting thing because, I've been on the app management side for the last 20 years, right? And I've really focused on applications and finding out, the heterogeneity of how you deploy many apps or the same app to many different deployments. A lot of what I have to do to this day is still around education and validation of the fact that people are trying to solve this problem. I assume when you started talking about security in 2016 and 2017, a big chunk of that was education. What was the inflection point for you to turn it from education into an actionable, hey, in 2021, security is the hottest topic that everyone's talking about. It's no longer kind of that, hey, this is nice to have, I should spend some money on it, because it's proactive, right?
Yep.
People always care about security reactively when there's a
Mhm.
price tag associated with it. What got you excited? I mean, like, how were you able to
Yeah.
make that inflection happen to the proactive?
Yeah, I think the inception for like how I knew it was important is because I knew VDI was everywhere, and the rise of ransomware and attacks and zero-day exploits were just going and going, increasing so much that like it could not be ignored. And VDI had been ignored up until that point. And really, I guess for like 15, 20 years, it wasn't really a focus. It was like always like, as long as you can get to it. But then what I realized, especially working with a lot of clients, is that's all their eggs and that's the basket, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
So it's the whole enchilada is in that deployment. And I think that's where I was like, hey, I've got to let people know. I got to like, yell it from the mountains. And so that's been real interesting to see that, because some people still, even today, when I've done presentations kind of all over the world now, that they're like, oh, I never thought about that. I never thought that if I publish an EMR to me and I just go to help about, I may be able to jailbreak that application. And you thought
Yes.
you were only publishing next gen EMR to me, but now I can eventually get domain user and domain admin credentials and then take over the whole network by just a single published application. It's like, oh, okay, yes, yeah, we'd like to look at that.
Well, the
Mhm.
mindset was always like, oh, if it's inside of my data center and it never leaves,
That's
I'm
right.
okay.
Yeah,
I'm okay. I got
yeah.
nothing to worry about. But I mean, what you're saying is that with the evolution of kind of security and kind of just the sophistication of people kind of coming in and getting access to these applications and data, what was good enough of being inside of the data center behind your protected walls, the fortresses has sprung some leaks.
Well, yeah, and if we look at the trend of just vulnerabilities and exploits and breaches, it all
Mhm.
comes from the inside, right? It's a phishing email, it's a phishing campaign, it's someone clicks on a malicious document or goes to a malicious URL, username, password, something goes on. and then terrible things start happening afterwards, right?
Yeah.
And it's because, for I guess about 15, 20 years, we thought, oh, all that mattered was the firewall,
Right.
right? Like as long as you got a firewall, but most people still have an any rule. So like I may have defined some things, but after that, whatever's okay, right? Especially
Yeah.
going out too. So that changed the game for a lot of people, and IT security is just growing and growing and growing. So it's pretty interesting, and cryptocurrency is part of that too, right? Because
Sure.
that's how successful attacks could get monetized. Back in the old 90s days and late 80s of hacking, there was no money involved. It was just kind of like leet, uber nerd, have fun with it, open up
Let's see if we
someone's
can break it.
CD-ROM. Let's just see if we can break it. Let's just boot them off AOL 22 times in a row or something. Like it was very benign, and it wasn't and the internet was so slow, you couldn't really steal that much, right? Whereas
Yeah.
now it's so fast, it's really like ransomware is kind of like it's still a concern, but like some of the things that is rising is what's called stealer logs, where it's basically a keylogger that gets put on people's systems that just ET phones home and sends in username and passwords. And I can go on Tor and I can buy people's username and passwords that were used in less than 24 hours ago. So I know it's a hot identity, as a
Right.
criminal. Whereas when I look at some of these, and you look at some of these exports, they're .mil, .gov, right? And they're big name companies. So there's single endpoints that are infected all over the world, hundreds of thousands of devices and into the millions. That's all it's doing. And so now attackers can be smarter because they used to just kind of spray and pray.
Yeah.
Now they're like, let's just focus on customer X, right? And especially if there's some socio-political thing going on too, then it's really just that much worse.
Yeah,
It's
we've
just very
seen such a
targeted, right?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen such a rise in reliance on it too, more frequently with the move through the pandemic of how many we're much more aware of it. Now your average everyday user is like, "Oh, hey, why can't I get this thing?" Well, they're now more aware of these problems. You see stuff like the Log4j issues that we saw recently,
Right.
where just massive problems that we're struggling with addressing. And on that topic, what are some of the main concerns people face in discovering those vulnerabilities?
So, I mean, the biggest thing is I know kind of like what Rimo3 is focused on, which is kind of that automation and testing, is getting the patches out. So many places that I do audits of, and I've done audits of some huge companies, multi-billion dollar companies, and their VDI image hadn't been updated in months, in some cases even years.
Wow.
And it's because it's kind of the old Citrix analogy of we don't cook it, we just serve it. And so what that means is like you're not going to change the recipe. You don't want to mess with the recipe. No salt, no pepper, just cook it the way it is, serve it the way it is. And it's because every time they've applied a Windows patch 6 years ago, 8 years ago, 3 months ago, it blew something up. And they're just like,
Right.
all right, nope, let's not do it. Like, let's just keep going. And then as long as it's not a patch that the CIO heard about on CISO online, I'm not going to do the patch because it's just like February 2022. Oh, what's in there? No big deal. It's only like 100 something high security updates. We'll be fine. And so that happens so often that it's just this huge delay, and you can't wait 30 days anymore. Some people would always be like in -1 of whatever that release is. And with the way patches and attacks are happening, insider threats, everything, you can't wait that long. You've got to have patch Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday rolled out to a system. Friday, Saturday, Sunday rolled out to some pilot systems. Monday, Tuesday, the next week, you should hopefully be about 50, 60% done. You should be really close so that within 7 to 10 days, you're out. And we know there's always going to be systems that don't ET phone home. And it's like there's always that couple percent that are never going to get the updates. And that's because they're on the VPN at the house. And I mean, to
Right.
your point, the work from home stuff really caused a huge problem where some of these devices haven't been updated since they got sent home in March of 2020. And I've still seen that, like doing audits. I'm like, whoa. And then it's like, oh, but it's on their home network. Well, yeah, so is Fortnite and Tiger King and everything else, right? Like who knows what's going on in that Wi-Fi network, right? What other devices, what IoT devices may have already been compromised? So yeah, patching is a huge thing, and that compliance.
Well, for us too, Patrick, one of the things that we found, I mean, it's great that you're giving examples of the fact that people haven't patched in months, right? But if you look at an enterprise, even with their daily IT operations, you've introduced me to a couple of things over in the past couple of months, right? Around CIS and compliance and governance bodies to get cyber insurance, which we'll touch on in a second. But one of the things that, was most interesting to me is, the number of, N plus 43 days. The fact that the typical enterprise, it takes 43 days from a day a patch comes out if they ever even deploy it, right? You're talking about the other end of the spectrum where people aren't deploying these patches unless they're high visibility for the CISO or the CI.
Yep.
Like, you're now in a situation where you're picking and selecting, which is a very dangerous game to kind of play, because you aren't necessarily the subject matter expert on every hot fix that's come out, the criticality of the bug or the security threat and posture.
Yeah, and you can't be now, right? Because
Yeah.
the one thing that I've found is, it's like OS patching is its own problem, right?
Oh, for
And
sure.
and, and it's so much, it's so often, and for a long time, people thought Macs were completely, invincible for these things, but now
Right.
they've starting to have a lot of CVEs too, and it's because
Hmm.
wherever the money and the users are is where the attackers are going, right? And
Right.
so when I look at some of those businesses and how they're doing patching and not doing patching, it's like, okay, it's just asking for it. And, those every day you go past that and, that's just part of it. But the next part is, after OS is the application.
Right.
So if you're not updating those browsers like almost once a week or two, you're at a risk, and the risk varies between month. And I think that's the hardest part as an IT nerd, just in general, not even security nerd, is keeping up. What's the things I need to know and I
Right.
need to do?
Mm.
Because I'm just floating around in the ocean, just trying to paddle, stay alive. There's some support tickets, close this, reboot that server, update that. Ooh, that broke, roll the update back. So I'm just treading water all the time. And so it's really hard for anybody to figure out what matters from the OS to the application. And then you've got application X, whatever you're using, whatever that main line of business application is. And I've seen people still stuck on Windows 7 because
Right.
of that application still,
Oh,
like
yeah.
today. And it's
Hmm.
like, and they're not an oddball. It's actually pretty common. And so when you've got old applications and an old operating system, it's a recipe for disaster.
I agree. I mean, and for us, last plug here for Remo, but that's, one of the customers that we've actually focused on. We did take that testing time down from, the 43 days of manual testing and the deployment rings that you alluded to. Why do deployment rings when you can test against all images, leveraging automation and get it out by Friday, to all your endpoints, right? So regardless of that environmental change, when you started talking about CIS and security controls, that's what got me really excited because they're seeing that as a problem, right?
Mhm.
If we talk about CIS for a second here, Patrick, like maybe you can explain to the broader audience, what CIS security controls are and why they exist, and a couple of examples of, people listening to you over the last 4 years and saying, actually, we need governing bodies and tight compliance and governance guidelines so that we will allow you to purchase cyber insurance, so that we will proactively protect you from threats as opposed to the reactive thoughts of the past.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, it's a good topic. And that's just like security policies in general. So,
Yeah.
CIS has lots of policies that are based on per operating system and user level. Like, what's the user doing? Is it just a level one user, a level two user, or is it an admin doing something? So, it if you deploy Windows, Mac, or Linux, next, pretty much any flavor, it's
Right.
insecure, right?
Yeah.
Because it's
Right.
all about making sure the application works, the user works, I can click on the things, I can run the things. Where CIS does is they go ahead and put something down and say, hey, a user shouldn't be able to join a computer to the domain. A user shouldn't be able to access any file share in the whole network. Like, no, you should be added to a group to access that, right? So it removes a lot of everyone in Active Directory and Windows systems overall.
Right.
And so that drastically changes the security posture, and it changes the authentication settings and stuff like that so that it's not using like landman passwords, it's using NTLM v2. So
Yep.
if I'm sniffing the network, I can't get those creds and crack them as easy as I could just a couple years ago. So those standards are basically kind of been born from the Defense Department, NSA, other computer councils in the EU, and Microsoft eventually, like, yeah, you deployed our operating system and our domain controller system and our networking solution, but here's all the settings you should do. And it's hundreds and hundreds.
Oh yeah.
And so when you go down some of these sys policy checklists, it's like, oh my God, like what did I get myself into? Glutton for punishment, because it's just so many settings. And so when you can do these, you can roll these things out, level 1, level 2, your admin policies, domain controller, member server. That's kind of like the big 5 that they do. You can actually then know, like, I'm doing kind of everything I can do with Windows with this operating system. And to your point with cyber insurance, there's a lot of places now that it's kind of like insurance maybe in the 80s where there wasn't the internet and it was just like, yeah, you pay us $100 a month, you crash your car, we'll give you 10 grand or whatever. Well,
Mhm.
now they're pulling your driving history actively. So they're going to give you like a CIS or NIST questionnaire and says, how are you doing your backups? Do you have tiered rollout? What's your patch cycle? And so some of them are going to be like the big questions, but then the others are going to be, do you have everything that's SSL v3 turned off?
Oh
If
yeah.
you don't, it's a ding. And that's where companies like IT Security Scorecard come in. The insurance companies will actually pay for that for anyone that's doing it. And that will scan the network, even just from the outside, and find old SSL certificates, expired sites, weak credentials, stuff like that. So now it's like the progressive little plug in your OBD2 port, right? So now it's not like, we trust you, here's $100 a month, you got $10,000 worth of coverage. Now it's run these things, answer these questions, and then we'll insure you. And if you don't do these things or we find certain things, your insurance rates go up. So I've seen clients that have went from, $10,000, $20,000 a year for multi-million dollar policies to then 80 to $180,000 for the same policy because of their findings. And because they didn't have privileged account management, they didn't have central password vaults, and they didn't have MFA on things, right? And so everybody is really getting tested now. So cyber insurance, every renewal, I usually sometimes get pinged because somebody also wants someone to do some vulnerability assessment or a pen test, right? So sometimes they'll actually bring VDI into that, or I'm just breaking into their office normally or sending phishing emails. So that's really, it's changed the game. Insurance is really changing the focus of cybersecurity, because right before that, it was just kind of like the CIO's problem, the
Yeah.
security stance, and
Yeah.
it never really made it to the board. Now, when they see that huge bill come, they're like, "Oh, what's going on? Oh, well, we were trying to get rid of Windows 7, but application X is holding us back. And then, when we applied the sys policy level 2, it broke Susan's
These
computer,
7
so we rolled it
apps.
back." And so these apps or these users or these
Yeah.
settings are oil and water, and they don't mix. And so it takes a lot of effort. And every IT administrator out there, no matter how big or small, even depending on how focused you are, you're still usually treading water. So if someone all of a sudden says, hey, you got to turn off all these old protocols, you got to turn on all these new settings for Active Directory, you got to turn on all these other policies, it can be maddening. And it's like, it's just trying to boil the ocean at that point. So you don't know where to start.
That's been one of the most interesting things for us, actually, Patrick. So, as you know, we focus on application testing, we focus on environmental testing. But when people have been moving from Windows 10 to Windows 11, it hasn't necessarily been the fact that there's application compatibility. Like the app is still going to work on the OS. It's the security hardening measures, the stuff you're doing with securing the infrastructure. It's the settings and GPOs that you have to enable, in order to ensure that you hit that sys level 1 compliance that are breaking applications. You talked about Susan's machine breaking or
Yep.
application X breaking. It's those build configurations. It's the environmental variables to achieve that sys level 1, sys level 2, whatever, that ends up impacting user performance and application performance. And that's one of the things we found. And I'd like to say I'm a genius and I, was Nostradamus and predicted this, but I'm not. We really kind of lucked out in the sense that it's actually the fact that we're doing the testing in their environment makes it contextually relevant to the GPO settings that they have, to the
Yep.
security posture, the security hardened image that we can test and say
Mhm.
whether an application will break. Not the vanilla. The vanilla is not going to break more often than not, right?
Yep. Yep.
So it's interesting that you bring that up because you just also alluded to the fact that not only um, from a pen testing perspective, can you give me an example of you breaking into their offices? What's that about? What do
Yeah.
you what type of compliance are you working on there?
Well, so everybody, there's a spectrum, just like everything in IT, where it's a hashtag, it depends, right?
Yeah.
So some people just want some kind of vulnerability scan where you just use like Nessus or a product like that. You
Okay.
scan the network. Hey, you're missing some patches. Patch those, patch those. Here's the criticals. There's the highs. There's the mediums. Just work your way
Got it.
down. Okay, cool. Well, then people will also, depending on if they're like a SEC company, PCI audits, depending on what compliance they fall into, state, local government, they have to have what's called a penetration test. Penetration test for some people is just doing a vulnerability assessment and send a report and be done.
Yeah.
So, but that definition is always highly contested in like the infosec world. But penetration test, in my opinion, it can still have a little bit of a spectrum. But I don't use the word penetration test in anything I do unless I run an exploit, right? So if I'm not running an exploit, it's just a vulnerability assessment, it's a health check, it's a security audit, it's a security review.
Because you're not
Penetration.
actively trying to penetrate
Hmm.
that. Okay, so
So
it's an
so
assessment.
think about
Gotcha.
it like this: like if it was like a whole apartment building with a bunch of doors, right? Like a vulnerability assessment is just like looking at them. Like I think all the doors are closed, right? Oh, that one's open, but they've got the little latch guard on it, right? Oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool. All right. Well, then some people will say, okay, well, let's do a penetration test. Now that's where I'm going to actually grab the door handle and turn it, and it might be unlocked, it might be locked, right? And that's what you're doing across the whole network. So you're using a vulnerability assessment to find the lowest risk and the highest risk targets, right? The easiest things to do, the lowest hanging fruit. And then you're running
Mhm.
an exploit on them so that then you were a domain user and now you're going to try to get that domain admin credential through
Yeah.
Kerber roasting and golding tickets and silver tickets and all these different ticket attacks that Active Directory has. And then you're going to go from that system to the next system. And then once you have your hold there, and many penetration tests, it's a capture the flag kind of thing where I've done virtual ones where it says get on the CFO's computer, right? Get on the CIO's computer.
Yeah.
And so then it's just like dropping a file on their system and then sending a net message that says hello. And sometimes I can be funny depending on the client, where it's like, do you like scary movies? And then that's all you do. And then you write the report, like, how did you get there? So,
Yeah.
and that's part of like the security thing too. It's an attack avenue. So a vulnerability assessment is hopefully going to scan all the things, all the networks to try to find the vulnerabilities. Penetration test will maybe find all the things that a vulnerability scan could find, but they're going to tell you the path they took and then how
Yeah.
to fix that path, right? Like, all right, so stop using your domain admin username and password to check your email, to browse the internet, and to log into Citrix with, right? Like keep those things separate. Have a separate admin account and a separate admin identity. And that goes back to CIS, right? CIS and some of these compliance standards, you shouldn't never be using your privileged account for non-privileged work, right? And then in penetration test, that's just digitally. Sometimes it's sending a phishing email to try to harvest credentials. Sometimes it's also using the breach data because there's 14.4 billion username and passwords that we have access to as penetration testers. So sometimes I just use an old username and password and it was winter 2016 and now it's just winter 2022, right? And it's like, bloop, you're in. And it's like, people are like, really? Like, yeah, sometimes it's that easy. And then
Thank God I
sometimes
can't use that old one.
yeah, yeah, I know. So then sometimes the penetration test is not digital, it's physical, where you actually go into someone's office and you're going to clone someone's badge. You're going to
Mm.
sneak up the fire door instead of the elevator. And so sometimes those are really fun. But, since everyone's closed down their offices, I haven't done any physical pen testing since 2019. It's just been like COVID, just sit at my home, and I can
I
still send emails and break into places, but breaking in is a lot more
I
fun.
mean, I could just picture you, Patrick, the nerdy James Bond, like, the badge cloner,
Yeah,
and you got like a little
yeah.
bit of a,
Well, so my biggest thing is I have a whole session of like how people break into your office that I've taught like all over the place, and it's one of my
yeah.
best ones to give. But what's fun about it is that I have polos from like every IT company kind of known to man, and I'll just wear khakis or jeans, and I will stake out a place doing recon and say like, oh, they're using Dell computers. I'll put a Dell shirt on. I'll print out a Dell purchase order or work order with just a logo from Microsoft Word, nothing fancy. And then I can even skim print a badge. So I can take a regular traditional badge and then put a Dell logo on it with my face on it. And then I just walk into a place like, hey, I'm here to replace Susan's computer. Well, Susan's on vacation. Like, yeah, I know. I saw her on Facebook. That's why I'm here. Can I get into her office and just swap these computers out real quick? Sometimes spray my face down with water, look real sweaty. In summer's the best time because I'm real pale, so I turn red real easy. So I'll get a little hot, and someone's trying to help me, right? Like, hey, oh yeah, let me help her.
Yeah.
And then there's been times when I've been in and I had broke into a spot, and I'll just kind of hang out, and they'll see that I'm working on a computer. Hey, are you working on a computer? Oh yeah, yeah. George said he couldn't print. Oh, well, let me come over and help you. And so I just become the random IT dude, and I help them
Oh, that's
fix the
awesome.
problem / install an implant to prove that I was there, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes it's really cool James Bondy stuff, but a lot of it is just Microsoft Word, right? Screenshots, writing things out, and because you will have to say the baby is ugly, right? That's like part of it. And but yeah, penetration testing is fun. Vulnerability stuff's good. And everybody has a big definition of those two things. But that's kind of my thoughts of what I see in the world.
That's been really insightful, Patrick. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and shed some light on the security and kind of the posture and where it's gone. Just one last question. I'd like to ask all my podcast guests, what's the next big thing?
Well, I mean, I think the next big thing is going to be continuation of like the government with CISA when they started to get some of those laws coming. I think there's
Yeah.
going to be a lot of laws like that getting passed in the United States and the EU and across the world because it's going to be kind of hard to deem like what's good content, legal content. So I
Yeah.
think there's going to be a lot of laws that are really going to put the kibosh down on things, which when CISA was going to be what it was going to be a couple years ago, that really worried the security community because it would mean that it could be deemed illegal to have Kali Linux, which is like a penetration distro of
Yeah.
Linux that we use to run all the tools and all that. And so that could be deemed illegal, just owning it or using it. And so that's the kind of thing I'm afraid of. Obviously, the cryptocurrency stuff is still booming. And I think in some cases, in my opinion, it's kind of like the beanie baby of currencies. And sometimes because there's so many new coins being created that
Yeah.
it's just kind of like the wild, wild west. And the metaverse is a whole nother thing that I think is interesting that, you can sell this virtual address in this universe and that universe. It's like Marvel on steroids, but people are going to pay real money to have metaverse.com and have this address on New York, in downtown Manhattan, and then they're going to buy it in this new metaverse and that one. So they'll have
Yeah.
the same piece of property owned multiple times with multiple different crypto coins. Um, I think ransomware and stuff like that is only going to get smarter because
Yeah.
if we look at some of that, like Oldsmore, Florida, that had their water treatment facility hacked, that people could have actually died from if they would have just taken a couple more minutes, it could have really, really been bad. And I
Yeah.
think things like that are going to keep happening. And if people aren't patching and aren't keeping things up to date and not having some kind of policy framework to go after, if they think just like installing Windows is secure, then they're on the wrong TV station for sure, right? Like it's wrong channel because there's lots of stuff to do. So I think that's going to be the big thing is kind of cryptocurrency, that rise, then
Coble
then
coin
every
coming soon.
yeah, exactly. Oh, Coble coin could be cool. Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds pretty cool. The only thing that's real interesting, I don't know if any of you have looked at making one, but like it, depending on what exchange you want to pay with and trade and broker
Yeah.
with, there's like a couple $1,000 initiation fee so that you can like put your coin on Coinbase or, CoinDesk and all that. And so it's like, so someone put the money in, but then it's like, oh, how are they making money then? Well, it's kind of like the Office Space 0.00002, right? Like they're getting a little nugget of every transaction. Like, oh, okay, I'm put the decimal in the wrong spot. Like they put it in the right spot, right? It's just like it's just small enough for you to not notice, right? Who gets all the half pennies,
Yeah. Well, that was
Cool.
fantastic, guys. I know we're up against time, but Patrick, as always, it's been a genuine pleasure. Thanks for taking the time and explaining your view of the world to us. It's always an interesting one. So appreciate it. And thank you all for joining the inaugural Rimo3 podcast with our subject matter experts. Look forward to seeing you all next time.
Perfect. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you'd like to know more about Rimo3, head over to Rimo3.com or find us on LinkedIn as Rimo3 Cloud. Make sure to subscribe and leave a review. We'd love to hear from you. Your thoughts on what was discussed, future topics, and more. Use hashtag Rimo3podcast and your topics could be covered on the show. Until next time.